On today's program, we will look at three strands that have emerged in the last 24 hours concerning Israel's war on Hamas. The United Nations is highlighting the costs of conflict for women. We look at where India stands in relation to Israel's war on Hamas and what explains that stand, and how countries like India in the so-called Global South are viewing what is arguably mixed messaging on the war from the European Union. But first, more on the large ground incursion from Israel that happened overnight. Israeli Army radio has been reporting that troops carried out a ground incursion into the Gaza Strip to attack Hamas positions. Israel's defense forces released this footage of the operation, describing it as the biggest incursion yet into Gaza. They say they attacked multiple Hamas targets before withdrawing. But that wasn't the ground invasion that's expected. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took to TV to announce that this was coming soon.
We're getting ready for a ground operation. I will not say when, how, or using how many soldiers. I will also not specify the conditions that are being taken into account, the majority of which are not known to the public. And this is how it should be. It's for the benefit of our soldiers. I want to be clear. The timing of the Defence Forces operation will be determined unanimously by the War Cabinet, along with the Defence Forces Chief of Staff. Jointly within the Cabinet, we are operating to ensure the best conditions for our fighters for future actions.
And my colleague Terry Martin earlier spoke to DW correspondent Tania Krämer in Jerusalem about that, but began by asking for more details on the overnight Israeli army incursion into Gaza.
Well, the Israeli army confirmed that they conducted what they called a targeted raid using tanks, and they also released this video where we see explosions happening, and that the infantry moved into the northern Gaza Strip as part of preparations, as they said, for the next stage. They also said they located and struck terrorist infrastructure and killed Hamas militants there, and this is an operation, as they put it, to prepare the battlefield. They went out afterwards. So this is one of the larger operations, according to Army radio. We've seen those shorter raids into Gaza in the past 2.5 weeks, but also the air strikes, Israeli airstrikes on Gaza continue in the north and in the southern part of Gaza. And we also had a barrage of rockets coming out from Gaza yesterday to Israel.
Now, we just heard Israel's Prime Minister there explaining that preparations are still underway for a ground operation, a full-scale operation. What are the Israelis themselves saying in anticipation of that operation, Tania?
Well, I think he needed to address the public again in Israel, because people want to know what is happening next. The region is very jittery. It's not just clear when the ground operation is happening, but there are a lot of different areas that Israelis are looking at in the south, in the north. And they also show, if you look at polls, they say, while they support the government in saying that they want to uproot Hamas from Gaza, the trust is not that big in what the government is doing. So Netanyahu said in his televised address that a ground operation or incursion will happen soon. He also said again that this will decide, the timing will be decided by the smaller war cabinet. And he also addressed the issue of the hostages. He said this is a top priority for the government. And he also touched briefly on the issue of the responsibilities for all of that, because Israelis, want to know who was responsible for this intelligence failure, that Hamas could so easily breach the borders and overrun the southern communities. But he just briefly touched on the responsibilities, said many people will have to answer this. That will be done after the war.
The war continues, meanwhile, with the Israeli Defense Forces targeting Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Satellite images have now emerged showing the extent of damage from those strikes. Now, these are Before and after images from areas in northern Gaza that have been experiencing heavy bombing, Israel has asked civilians in northern Gaza to head south to avoid casualties. These satellite images released by Maxar Technologies. Earlier, my colleague Terry Martin spoke with Hiba Tibi, country director for the humanitarian organization Krämer, responsible for the West Bank and Gaza. He asked what care workers are telling her about the situation in Gaza.
Unfortunately, it's a reality and a fact. It's a testimony from my colleagues, not one, not two, the 5 of them who are who evacuated to the south. They left their houses. There are no houses to go back to, by the way. 3 of them, their houses are completely destroyed. 2 of them, they don't know if it's safe to go back to their homes, but they are unable to stay in the south. They are staying in apartments designed for 10 people, but they are sharing it with 80 people. They cannot sleep, they cannot access water, and it's under constant shelling. And by the way, those who stayed in the north, most of them who did not evacuate because of the fact that they cannot afford going to the south. The liter of fuel became extremely expensive. So for a family, an average family, to transport from the north, I'm talking 10 days ago, because every day, by the hour, the price of fuel gets higher. So in the beginning, it would cost the family around 1,000 shekels, which is around $350, and they cannot afford it.
Right. Now, you've issued a statement saying that what's happening in Gaza now is beyond what your team had envisioned as a worst-case scenario, but things could get even worse, couldn't they?
Yes, unfortunately, if the UN, as they announced, are going to stop providing services, if the hospitals are going to stop their services, honestly, I don't know what will be the situation. Already we see doctors, we have some contacts with partners with doctors who are providing medical services. They are doing surgeries using vinegar instead of the minimum anesthesia requirements. They are treating people on the floor outside the hospitals. They are very tired, but still they are trying to find a way. Medical supply, electricity, access to water. The contagious diseases now are breaking in a very scary way in the overcrowded shelters in the UN and even beyond. All of the information that we get, unfortunately, comes only from the shelters that are run by the UN. We don't even count what is happening in the surrounding areas with the crowded apartments, similar to what my colleagues are facing. So this is going to be an unimaginable. I can't even find words to describe what will happen if the situation continues to be like this, with no humanitarian supply, fuel or water restructured in Gaza, and most importantly, if the ground invasion occurs in amid of all of what we are seeing already now.
Hiba Tibi there from the organization Krämer. Where wars rage, women suffer. That was the message from the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the Security Council. Violence in the Israel-Hamas war is the latest reminder of how global conflict wreaks havoc on women's rights.
Relentless bombings, terrorist killings, displacement and kidnappings. There's been a dramatic escalation of violence during the Israel-Hamas conflict, and women and girls are suffering disproportionately. The UN Secretary-General's annual report on women, peace and security estimates that more than 600 million women and girls lived in conflict-affected countries in 2022. It says the Middle East conflict shows how women are increasingly at risk and underrepresented in peace processes.
The Middle East is witnessing a dramatic escalation of violence. To date, more than 1,400 Israelis have been killed by the horrific attack by Hamas, many of whom are women and children, and an estimated 200 remain as hostages, many of whom are women. And Gaza has been under devastating, relentless bombardment, killing more than 6,000 people, a majority, 67% of whom are women and children.
Where wars rage, women suffer. Where authoritarianism and insecurity reign, women and girls' rights are threatened. We see this around the world. UN Women estimates that the eruption of violence and destruction has already resulted in close to 493,000 women and girls being displaced from their homes in Gaza. The violence has also seen an upsurge in the number of widows. An estimated 900 women have lost their partners and become, as the UN says, the heads of households.
All of their homes are gone. My home fell on me. My daughter, the flower of the household, is dead. Look at these children. They've been injured like me. They took us out of the rubble. How are we at fault? Now we live humiliated in tents.
Of the scores of hostages taken by Hamas in the terror attack on southern Israel on the 7th of October, a large number were women and girls.
I only know that my sister is kidnapped in Gaza, and I do not know if she's still alive. It's really hard for me to say that, and I do not know her status now. And I just want her to come back safe and sound with all the others as soon as possible.
The UN wants better support for women and girls, and it says women must be more involved in crisis mediation and the peace-building process.
The role of negotiations in the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is something that India too is pushing. An official statement from the Foreign Ministry talks of negotiations to establish, quote, a sovereign, independent and viable state of Palestine. It's always been a part of India's official stance on the long-running conflict, but the current hostilities have kicked up more than usual divisive reactions within the country.
Anger on the streets of Delhi against Israeli government and in solidarity with Palestinian people. Police quickly shut it down.
I'm here supporting Palestine because settler colonialism should end.
This woman was stopped from speaking to us.
Just as the protesters were beginning to gather here outside the Israeli embassy against its action on Gaza, police have started detaining them, and now they're being taken to the police station.
Right-wing Hindu groups have a different experience. When they organized pro-Israel demonstrations in different parts of the country, police were nowhere to be seen.
Strongly stand with the innocent citizens of Israel.
Israel's representatives in India welcomed these rallies.
We are very grateful for everyone showing support during these days to Israel. We have seen the solidarity. We are very thankful and grateful for that. We see all the pro-Israeli protests all over India, and it really warms our heart.
Pro-Israeli demonstrations don't only express solidarity with those killed by Hamas on October 7th. Right-wing Hindus have been using them to fan hatred against Indian Muslims, falsely linking Hamas, citizens in Gaza and Muslims in India.
I want to tell Prime Minister Modi that by sending aid to Gaza, he is helping the Islamic jihadis and enemies of Hindus. I request him to not commit this sin. Israel's enemies are also the enemies of Hindu religion.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Hindu nationalist BJP government may gain from such pro-Israel rallies on the domestic front, but he's unlikely to change the country's foreign policy to match. G. Parathasarathy says India will keep its own national interest above choosing sides in the Israel-Gaza conflict.
I don't think Israel has a closer partner than India, anywhere in the Indian Ocean neighborhood. So, yes, we will certainly listen to them, but we will act according to our best national interests. And by and large, we have had a friendly relationship with all Arab countries.
Indian authorities repressed demonstrations of anger against Israeli actions at home, while at the same time, the government continues its balancing act of interests abroad.
All right, let's get more context on this from one of India's most prominent foreign policy experts, Happymon Jacob. He's an associate professor at Delhi Jawaharlal Nehru University and also the founder of the Council for Strategic and Defence Research. Professor Jacob, On the 7th of October, as news of the Hamas terror attack broke, Prime Minister Modi tweeted that India was standing in solidarity with Israel. Now, there was no mention, as generally used to be the case in official Indian pronouncements, about Palestinians. Is Narendra Modi taking a side in this conflict?
Well, I would like to put that in some perspective. I believe that there was some initial confusion in Delhi, and Mr. Modi's tweet was mostly political in nature and did not really reflect India's long-standing view of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. So he did sort of put out that tweet in favor of Israel, and the Ministry of External Affairs then stepped in and sort of put out what I call a fantastic tweet, which basically balanced all sorts of positions. It spoke about the issue of terrorism. It spoke about the two-state solution, which India has consistently supported, and it also spoke about the need to respect human rights and international humanitarian law. And thereafter, Mr. Modi spoke to the Palestinian Authority chief, Mr. Abbas, and then came out with another tweet in support of Palestinians, and then did send humanitarian assistance to Palestine. So my sort of take on this sort of unfolding of events is that political India, in some ways, let's say the BJP is in office in New Delhi, and the right wing in India seems to be in favor of Palestine, but that does not really reflect the Indian state's current position or the long-standing position, which has been, I would say, very balanced.
But let's talk about the attitude then, because the original tweet from Narendra Modi, do you not think it was telling for the attitude that prevails in India right now, given that we are also seeing, and we saw this in a report that we are playing, that pro-Palestinian protests are being broken up, whereas pro-Israel protests are being allowed. The general majority, the view appears to be very pro-Israel, correct?
I don't disagree with that entirely. I think of the people who are vocal about it in the social media or otherwise are pretty much pro-Israel. India has grown close to Israel over the last many years. In fact, India has over the past decades or decade or so managed to have a balancing act in the Middle East. It has excellent relationship with countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, and on the other hand with Israel, and it has managed to sort of create that balancing act without really worrying too much about how its stance on Palestine will impact this balancing act. But having said that, to answer your question very specifically, yes, I agree that political India seems to be supporting Israel more than Palestine.
And just to expand on that, are we not also seeing particularly right-wing Hindu groups use the Hamas terror attacks to vilify Muslims? Is that something that you would say is also happening?
I am going to be more careful about that. I don't think that is a mainstream expression in India. That could potentially be considered as some of the extremist elements in the Indian right wing or the Hindutva sort of political, let's say, persuasion, trying to use this for vilifying the Muslims. So, that does happen from time to time, but that's certainly not the mainstream political sentiment in India. That's certainly not also the feeling within the BJP. Certainly not a mainstream feeling within India. That is an isolated sentiment. At least, that's the feeling I'm getting sitting where I am.
The personal chemistry between Narendra Modi and Benjamin Netanyahu has been there for all to see. And I think our viewers might be interested to know that India, even though it recognized Israel in 1950, only established diplomatic ties in 1992. Could you just give us a quick primer as to what drives the India-Israel relationship?
Israel is one of those states that India considers is an ally that comes to India's aid and support as and when it is necessary. Going back to the 1999 Kargil war that India fought with Pakistan, the urban legend in India is that Israel rushed weapons to India at the time of India's need, emptying its own stocks. I mean, however exaggerated that may be, it has caught on in the Indian sort of popular imagination. Israel has stood by India in terms of giving us advanced weaponry, technologies, and sort of getting into joint ventures with Indian defense establishment. In sort of times when the Americans and other Western partners were unwilling to sell India weapons, the Israelis sort of stood by India. So there is a certain history in terms of this robust partnership. But at the same time, you mentioned the sort of romance between Mr. Modi and Netanyahu. There is also a great deal of chemistry between, say, for example, Mohammed bin Salman and Mr. Modi. So Modi has managed to sort of break the mold, the traditional mold that India operated, which is you have to cater to a certain sentiment regarding Palestine in order to be playing a certain role in the Middle East. He's sort of broken out of that mold. So I wouldn't sort of necessarily say that because Mr. Modi is close to Netanyahu, he's forced to take an anti-Palestine stand, or that he will have to take an anti-Muslim stand. I think that doesn't really necessarily translate. That's not the logic I would use.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thanks so much for bringing that very important context on where India stands in relation to the current war between Israel and Hamas. Professor Happymon Jacob in Delhi. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Countries like India and the so-called Global South have also been observing with interest how Europe has reacted to the Israel-Hamas war. Arguably muddled and mixed messaging from the EU has already ruffled feathers, not just within Europe, but also in the Arab world, for instance. Our Brussels correspondent, Rosie Burchard, reports.
The streets of a continent divided. For weeks, people have been showing up across Europe to express outrage about events in the Middle East.
They are set free.
The corridors of power have been divided too, with the European Union struggling to speak with one voice.
Cutting electricity, cutting food to a mass of civilian people is against international law.
We are friends of Israel, and when a friend is under attack, we have to stand together.
Of course, this is a time for a ceasefire. This is a time to stop this violence.
There will be no security and no peace for either Israel or the Palestinians if terrorism continues like this.
Add to the mix a commissioner saying funding for Palestinians would be suspended, only for officials to backtrack within hours, and all this makes for a foreign policy cacophony. James Moran long served as one of the EU's top Middle East envoys. He had to balance strong European support for Israel with the bloc's position as the top donor to Palestinians.
Traditionally, of course, the EU has managed to more or less keep an even-handed approach to crisis after crisis in the Middle East, and that has been, to some extent, its value added, because it has been, I think, seen by both sides, but particularly on the Arab side, as being an honest broker.
But now something has changed.
This time it's a little different because we've had a little bit of confusion on the EU side about that even-handedness. The initial comments made by presidents and prime ministers, and indeed here in Brussels at the institutions, were overboard pro-Israeli. And I think the Arab world has reacted quite badly to that, and some damage has been done.
Damage on full display at a recent peace summit in Egypt, where comparisons were drawn with Western responses to the war in Ukraine.
Anywhere else attacking civilian infrastructure and deliberately starving an entire population of food, water, electricity, and basic necessities would be condemned. And it has been done before, recently, in another conflict. The message the Arab world is hearing is loud and clear. Palestinians' lives matter less than Israeli ones. The application of international law is optional.
The EU rejects allegations of double standards.
Hamas as a terrorist organization is deeply embedded within Palestinian society in Gaza. So if in the war between Russia and Ukraine, Russia is bombing civilian infrastructure without the pretense of trying to hit military targets. But in Gaza, when Israel is attacking military targets, because Hamas uses civilians as human shields, there can be civilians there as well.
But as Middle Eastern negotiators do their best to get hostages out of Gaza, some say Europe looks more like a bystander than a broker. And that's left some in the so-called Global South wondering who speaks for Europe and what it even stands for.
The Indian audiences or the Indian news channels were not really discussing that, but now this particular division sort of comes to fore. These kind of things which were still kept, I would say, not if hidden, but at least managed in the Ukraine conflict for a long, because then, of course, everybody was united. But when it came to the Middle East and this kind of a thing, so what it actually does is that it really takes away that credibility, right, of a particular actor. So you understand that there's only so much that you can expect from Europe because, see, it is really eternally divided.
The EU is trying to clarify its position and quieten the cacophony. While there's no way the bloc will stop supporting Israel, its most recent statements say the country has the right to self-defence within the limits of international law. Brussels has also tripled immediate humanitarian aid funding for Gaza. But will that be enough to repair the EU's diplomatic image?
If you were in your diplomatic postings just now, what would you be saying when you're calling back to the capital?
Well, I would be saying take time out to see Arab leaders, talk to them, understand their position. In the longer run, if we're ever going to get out of this cycle of violence, the EU does have an important role to play in getting back to some kind of peace process, which has been dead now for years. So hopefully there will come a time, not now, it's too early, but down the road, where the EU can get back to playing its traditional role as a broker in the middle, between, on the one hand, the Americans and so forth, and the Israelis, and the Arab world on the other.
Moran says getting there won't be quick or easy. But with Israeli hostages and Palestinian civilians trapped inside Gaza, time is on no one's side.
And that's it for now. There's more updates on the Israel-Hamas war on our website, dw.com, and on our Facebook and X pages. I'm Binesh Banerjee in Berlin. Thanks so much for watching.